"O my queen," said the royal sorcerer to Hatshepsut, "with this amulet, you and your descendants are endowed by the goddess Isis with the powers of the animals and the elements. You will soar as the falcon soars, run with the speed of gazelles, and command the elements of sky and earth." 3,000 years later, a young science teacher dug up this lost treasure and found she was heir to the secrets of Isis. And so, unknown to even her closest friends, Rick Mason and Cindy Lee, she became a dual person. Andrea Thomas, teacher.
Almighty Isis.
And Isis, dedicated foe of evil, defender of the weak, champion of truth and justice.
One of the things I had fun with, I had a rhyming dictionary. So I was always making up the poems that she would say to invoke her powers.
Welcome back, my friends, to an all-new episode of the Shazam ISIS podcast. It's your old mentor, John S. Drew here, and we're continuing our journey down the highways and byways of the land, enjoying and reviewing those episodes of the iconic 70s television shows we love the most, Shazam and the Secrets of Isis. And joining me on this continuing journey, as he's been since the beginning, is the Big Red Cheese himself, Mr. Richard F. Lee. Hey, Richard.
Well, hello, Dr. John Drew. It's great to be here on this special program. And hey, we've got something different today, don't we?
We definitely do. Now, we've brought you interviews before with some of the people who were involved in the production of the TV show, whether it's some of the writers, the guest stars, or the actors in the series themselves. But this time we've got something really special. For the last couple of episodes, you've noticed that Richard and I, at the beginning of each episode, have been reviewing one issue of the Mighty Isis comic book that ran from DC Comics back in the 70s. Well, we've got one of the writers here with us. With a comic writing career spanning the 70s through the 90s, Jack C. Harris has written almost every major character in the Marvel and DC universe, from Batman to Spider-Man to Wonder Woman. He was also the writer of DC's The Mighty Isis comic from issues 4 to 8 before it was canceled in 1978. When it ended, the plot left a lot of questions, and we're hoping to get some of the answers here on the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Jack C. Harris. Hello.
Oh, thank you, John.
So, Jack, before we can get into, ISIS and such, let's get a little background here. How did you get into comic writing as it is? Because I know I tried back in the 80s. I was sending in scripts to DC Comics all the time to editor Bob Greenberger, but no success.
Okay, it began, again, I'm a lifelong comic book fan, so that always helps.
Right.
But I attended college at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, studying illustration of all things. And while I was there, you might have remembered, Michael Uslan, who was out in the University of Indiana, began his iconic comic book course that basically led him to be the producer of all the Batman movies.
Right.
And he got a lot of publicity from that. And myself and a few friends at the Philadelphia College of Art were reading all of this. We decided, can we do it there? And we tried and succeeded in doing a course at the University of the Arts on the history of comics. And during that course of the course, we got a number of writers and artists to come speak at our course, including Denny O'Neil, Dick Giordano, and a few others, Len Wein. And so when I graduated, I naturally, since I had made all these contacts, I applied for and got a job at DC Comics as an assistant editor under Murray Boltinoff, who was the editor at the time at DC. And I spent 8 years there as an assistant editor and later an editor. I actually handled some of the public relations along the way, and it was quite a run, and I really enjoyed it. But that's basically how I started. Started out wanting to be an artist, but I found it was a lot easier to be a writer. It was a lot easier to write things like 10,000 Indians come riding over the hill than it was to draw it. So
Yeah.
That's why I became a writer. So that's how it happened. That's how it started.
So, Jack, you started your time on the Mighty Isis comic book with DC with the 3rd issue backup story, doing the script.
Right.
So, how did that come about?
Okay, it's funny. This is the very first comic book I wrote for DC. I had been there for a couple of years as an editor and assistant editor. I had written a number of fill-in pages here and there, but this was the first comic I actually wrote. Denny O'Neil, who was the editor of ISIS, had a plot from Steve Skates, who had written a number of the other things, and I guess it was a deadline. I forget exactly the circumstances, but he said, "Can you dialogue this for me?" I said, "Sure, I can." So I took it on, just dialoguing over Steve Skates' original plot, and Denny liked what I did. So I think Steve was off doing other things. So he said, "Well, can you write me a full script for the next issue? I just need a 12-pager to start it out with." And I was happy to, and so that began my writing career with ISIS. The first issue I actually wrote the lead to was number 4.
Right.
And it was a story called what was it called? It was called the Lake Monster or something like that. I forget the exact title.
It was involving a lake monster, The Treasure of the Lost Lake.
Treasures of the Lost Lake. That's right. It's based on a real place. I used to vacation up at Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire. And so I based the story on Lake Winnipesaukee up there. And I think if I remember right, I actually wrote my vacation off on my taxes as research that year for that story. So if you look at the story, there's a sign where the characters drive into Wolfboro, and there's a sign that says "Welcome to Wolfboro, the country's oldest resort town." And I took a photograph, and Mike Vosberg, who drew it, recreated the sign exactly. And in fact, the local newspaper in Wolfboro, New Hampshire, wrote it up that they were featured in the comic book. So that was kind of fun.
Now, when you got the assignment, did you get a chance to watch any of the episodes, or had you been seeing any of the series?
I had been watching them. And at the beginning, they wanted us to adhere to the television series quite a bit. But I think right after that issue, number 4, I remember I got sort of carte blanche to do what I wanted to with the character. And I'm not sure of the reasons why. I don't know if Filmation I don't know what their particular arrangement was with DC, but I remember when I first did my first full issue, I remember Denny telling me that you can do whatever you want. Just don't, make any kind of major changes in the character, but you can certainly explore anything you want to do with it. So that started with number 5, if I remember right.
Right.
What did you think of the TV show?
Well, the TV show, I had mixed feelings. First of all, I thought, what's her name, Joanna Cameron?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think she was gorgeous. She was gorgeous. So that was fun to watch. But I thought, and the stories were, basically simplistic. What I really disliked about it at the end, there was a little preachy moment that she would come and explain the moral of the story to the kids as if they were too stupid to figure it out. I didn't like that particular aspect of the show. But I liked some of the other stuff. I liked the one of the things I had fun with. I had a rhyming dictionary. So I was always making up the poems that she would say to invoke her powers. So that's one of the things they did on the television show all the time, which is always rhyming something to make her powers work. And that I liked, And then, but I also noticed that they didn't do much with the character, her secret identity. So that's what I picked up on the comic. It did a lot of background and backstory in the comic book that they did not include in the television show. But yeah, I watched the whole thing. I watched it all the time. That and Shazam as well.
Now, once you took over with the 4th issue, like you said, you had a little more carte blanche. So the stories took a more interesting, and at times I thought even, and I'm not downplaying this or saying anything's wrong, it was a little darker at times. I remember the Ooze issue that as a kid, I thought it was startling to see the skulls on the front cover and the camel that had been consumed by the ooze. And of course, I was fascinated with the Blob as a kid. But as far as that, what brought about that whole change? Was it just the whole idea of trying to figure out her identity?
Yeah, well, I wanted to do, what I wanted to do was just something totally different with it. I wanted to get away from the preachiness of the television show. I figured they can do that by going to her background and some of her personal life and things like that. And then, of course, I wanted to get things that they couldn't or wouldn't do on television.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's something else, too. Since Filmation kind of let go of their hold, so to speak, and you had a little more carte blanche, how did it wind up then that DC wound up, because this is always something I've been curious about, how did they wind up with the character in the end as far as this comic version, or was that their whole thing, is like they sort of tailored it, or you did, so that it became theirs?
They don't, as of right now, they don't own the character at all.
No.
I forget who actually holds the copyright on it, but DC does not. They relinquished it after a while, so I don't think they own the copyright on it anymore. But I think they used it for a time after the television show was over, but I'm not positive on that. I don't really recall.
Okay.
With the 8th issue of the Mighty Isis comic book, the comic was abruptly canceled, as you recall. It was pretty abrupt that there's only 2 issues earlier that there was talk of bringing Captain Marvel for an issue. What caused the cancellation of the series of Mighty Isis? Was it the sales?
Probably. And again, I don't recall, and I'm not even sure if I was privy to the information at the time. I'm not even sure if they told me why it was being canceled, but it just was. And I'm pretty sure, I can't remember completely, but I'm pretty sure I had other stories plotted along the way. If I remember correctly, the one storyline was with her boyfriend or her companion, whatever his name was, I've forgotten. Rick had been taken over by somebody.
Right.
Had stolen his identity, and we didn't resolve that. So I think when we left with issue 8, he was still possessed by, the Serpent King, I believe.
Yeah, John's
we were going to obviously explore that and get him out of that, but that's why I had to leave him. So
that's that image of Rick Mason with his face stuck in a pyramid is still issue 7, and it's still in my mind to this day. And after 40 years as a kid growing up, I'm wondering to myself, did Rick Mason ever get out of that pyramid?
Did he ever get out of the pyramid? I know. Well, yeah, I'll tell you a little secret about that story now. Okay, the whole concept of that was based on a story that I read many years earlier. If you want to, I looked it up the other day just to revive myself. It was in a comic called House of Mystery, number 94, and there was a story that was illustrated by Nick Cardy, beautifully illustrated by Nick Cardy, called The Secret of the Sorcerer's Coin. And the coin had the same problem as this pyramid had. If somebody touched it, they were absorbed by the coin, and whoever was previously trapped in the coin took over their body. So that was where I got the inspiration for that particular moment in the comic, was that old Nick Cardy story that I love so much from an old issue of House of Mystery. So.
Now, in that 8th issue, like we saw, you said Rick was trapped. We also had that introduction of that boy who had, and I got a kick out of this, and I wondered, was that on purpose that you specifically used that word, mutant power? Because, of course, automatically we our minds turn to the X-Men when you talk about mutants.
Yeah, right. That bothered me at the time, too. I'm sitting, should I call him a mutant or not? Then I realized that, mutant was in the comics long before Marvel and DC had it. I mean, if you remember the character Captain Comet, he was a mutant, and that's what they called him back way in the early 50s. So mutants were around in comics long before they were running around just in the X-Men. So I was sort of on the fence back and forth, should I call him a mutant? And I said, what the hell? So I will. I called him a mutant. So I was definitely thinking about that when I did it, though.
So did you write that? I know when you wrote the script for the story, but did you write the word balloons on the cover of the Mighty Isis, like it says?
I don't know. That would be Denny O'Neil who did that.
Okay.
Or in that particular one, I think Al Milgram was the editor at that point. So probably Al wrote the copy on the cover.
On the cover, because it does mention the mutant power, mutants.
Yeah. So he picked up from the interior story, but the editor usually wrote the cover dialogue, not the writer, unless the writer had a specific idea that he wanted on the cover. But I'm pretty sure that Alan Milgram probably did that one.
Now, you mentioned that you had plotted out a few more issues. I mean, because obviously this has to be done ahead. What other ideas did you have going forward with the series?
Well, I think most of it was had to do with her backstory. If you remember, I think I introduced her mother at one point in the early stories, and named her after my own mother, matter of fact. So, and then Rick being possessed by the villain, that was going to be the storylines. I was plotting the backup story more than the actual villains of the story. That was going to be the ongoing drama in the story, with her encountering a different menace along the way. So I was concentrating on that rather than exactly what she was going to go up against. So I don't recall what I was going to do after that, except for developing the backstory more along the way. So who knows? I know that, of course, she was going to battle the Serpent King again later, but beyond that, I really didn't have anything planned that I can recall.
There was one thing I loved about the whole sequence, though, was that earlier on you had mentioned it, and I thought it was a great idea, was that Isis's magic would hide the fact that she looked exactly like Andrea. So that's why people never put two and two together, which they still couldn't do anyway. It wasn't magic. They just seemed to be all dense on the TV show. But here in the comic, it's like, okay, this is why we don't tell the difference. And yet the irony of it is, at the very end, she's tricked by what she normally would do, because he's using magic of sorts. She doesn't realize Rick is actually trapped, and she's walking away with the Serpent King. Right.
It's like the nice thing about writing magic, you make up your own rules. You can just it doesn't matter. You can just, as long as you're consistent with it, you can play around with it when you want. If you remember, I think we did the origin once in one of the issues. I forget exactly which one it was.
Yes, it was.
But you had an old wizard, but we never named him. We never told you who he was. Of course, it was Shazam, but we didn't want to do that because we didn't know what the television show was going to do. So we just left it vague. It might have been Shazam, but I'm really not sure. But yeah, it was him. But I couldn't say it in the book.
We all know that it had to be the Wizard Shazam.
Right, yes, of course.
Before John goes on to his other question, this burning issue still it's consuming me, Jack. I have to know. How did Rick Mason get his identity back? I need to know.
Obviously somebody else touches that pyramid, and he is released. Somebody else along the way. I forget. I haven't surely, but he's definitely released after a couple of issues in some very dramatic fashion that that we were going to do. And the thing I again, like you said, is that horrific shot of him trapped in the pyramid. What I think of most of the time, and it's usually because of my art background, is that I think in visuals. It has to be visually exciting in order for it to happen. So that's why they have that sequence of him trapped in the thing. There's another sequence where she changes into a snake in like a 3 or 4 panel sequence where she alters, or somebody does, one of the characters does. And so I was always thinking in pictures rather than words and descriptions. So that's where I was going, trying to get something that would, attract attention on the cover, that would draw the readers in.
So you're thinking in terms of pictures. Was it you or was it the artists that came up with the idea? Because I noticed when you took over also, when Isis would cast her spells, there were glowing pyramids around her hands.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting thing. Jeanette Kahn, who was the publisher at the time, she had a friend who was very much into, I forget, I think he was a designer or something, I forget. He was very much into that whole pyramid power. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, yeah.
There was a whole thing going on. Yeah. And so I went and met him, and we had a talk, and he was talking about how, pyramid power would fit perfectly into the ISIS story and all. And so that's what we added. So I added that in the script. I directed the artist to do that. So that was sort of a collaborative idea from the publisher and her designer friend and me, all to put that into that visual.
So this was then your first professional writing gig, was the Mighty ISIS.
Yep. That's right.
Wow.
And it led to, it's funny, at one point, I was writing all of DC's female characters, like all of them. I was writing Wonder Woman and Supergirl and Batgirl and ISIS, and I was editing Starfire all at the same time. So I don't know, I was just the go-to guy for female characters. I don't know why, but that's how it ended up.
And you would go on then to continue to write for DC and Marvel regularly right through the mid-'90s. And I myself, while I can't remember if you wrote issues that I read specifically, I was very happy to see when I was looking over your bio and stuff that you had a hand in Kamandi, The Last Boy on Earth. It was like one of my favorite series.
I wrote quite a bit of those. I wrote from about, 48 maybe, and through to the end. I think I picked it up around then, because I know I did the 50th issue, so it was sometime a few issues before that, and then all the way to the end of the series, of the first series. So, that was great fun.
It was a great series. I mean, to me, it was around the time I was seeing Planet of the Apes, so we saw a future Earth there. There's Kamandi, and then Thundar the Barbarian, the cartoon starts.
Right. Well, I mean, the thing about Kamandi, it's like, you can't classify it. It's not a superhero story. It's not, it's science fiction, and yet it's, I don't know. You can't put it in a category. It was just totally unique, and it was all Kirby. I mean, Kirby, like in one of the early issues, he drew a map of the Earth after disaster, and I used that as my guide. And the things that he hinted at, I tried to create stories to match that map as Kamandi wandered through the Earth. I had a lot of fun with that series.
Did you ever get any feedback from him on your work?
From Kirby?
Yeah.
Not directly, no, I don't believe so. I only met him about 3 times along the way. Once when I was still a fan, and I think I met him in DC offices maybe once or twice, just in passing.
Right.
We didn't have any kind of great long conversations. But
very cool. Very cool. So now, what are you doing these days?
Well, I'm semi-retired, but I still teach a writing course at the School of Visual Arts in New York.
Oh.
I still do that. Once a week I go in and get kids to write comics well, hopefully. And a lot of them, since it's an art school, a lot of them don't know the format of scripting, of a comic book script. And for every writer, there's a different format, but I use one that everyone has always liked. Every time I wrote a script or when I was editing, it was always a good format to use, and everyone seemed to like it. So that's what I teach. I teach them how to present a story to an artist. If somebody else is going to draw your story, you have to have a particular script so that you can keep control of the story, so that you know exactly what's going to happen and what the artist is going to draw. So I teach that second semester every year.
Second semester, okay.
January. Yeah.
Very nice.
So been doing that for 20 years.
So
that's how I keep my finger in the comic book industry, is by doing that course.
Oh, that's the only thing you do, though, is just teach that to,
that's about it, right? That's it. Like I said, I'm pretty well retired right now, and so is my wife. So we sit around, we travel. We do little weekend trips everywhere, and we, we're enjoying being retired. It's very nice.
Do you ever do any conventions?
Oh yeah, in fact, I'm going to Akron in November, and they're celebrating the 40th anniversary of Black Lightning, for which I was the original editor. Oh. So it's going to be me and Tony Isabella and Trevor Von Eden, and the original creative team of Black Lightning, and we're all going to be there together. First time since that book was out 40 years ago. So
wow. Are you looking forward to the TV show?
Oh yeah, very much so. And then I always go down to Baltimore for Saturday. Usually it's Saturday, I go down to the Baltimore convention just to say hi to a bunch of friends. But so those are the two conventions I'm going up in the near future. Baltimore and Akron, Ohio.
Now you live in New Jersey, right?
I do.
You do. Have you ever been to East Coast Comic Con? They're right there in New Jersey.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been
that,
there.
and I've gone to the Asbury Park Con that they have a couple times. So yeah. Very
cool.
Yeah, I've been to those.
So a social media question: how can people reach out to you if they want to remain in contact?
I'm on Facebook. So
that's how I found
link up to me on Facebook. Yeah, right. I'm on Facebook. You can message me through Facebook. That's fine.
Okay. All right, Jack. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate because it's like I said, I only read the 6th issue, was the Blob one, but going back and getting the other issues and doing it for the podcast here, it was a lot of fun. And it's a shame that we didn't get to see, more of this, because you did take it in a very interesting direction.
It was fun.
So,
I'd love to pick up on it again, but who knows?
Who knows? If they do, we got to ask that you come back and write it, though.
Oh, sure. I would love to.
Would you, if you had it to do over again, would you have suggested some type of Captain Marvel ISIS team up that with some idea that you had in mind that you wanted to see?
Oh yeah, I mean that was always the goal. We were going to do it eventually. We were going to link them up as well. They did it on the television show,
right?
So we figured, we could do it in the comics too. We were definitely planning it. That was definitely on the drawing board supposedly. So we just never got around to it.
Oh well.
Yeah. That's disappointing because I think we would like to see that today. Even I know all the fans of the podcast would love to see you write a story with that could happen today.
Oh yeah.
Well, has there ever been, because we had the Batman 66 series and Wonder Woman 77. Do you know if there's ever been any talk about doing Shazam or ISIS 75?
Not that I've heard of. I haven't heard anything about that. Yeah, it would be fun.
Yeah.
It's funny. The whole thing about Captain Marvel is just very peculiar anyway, if you've ever gone through the history of Captain Marvel, because he was basically more of a cartoon character than Superman ever was.
Right.
And yet he at one point was outselling Superman. And then, of course, Superman sued him, and they quit, and then eventually he gained the rights to him, and that's how he came back. But so the history is very odd there. It's very very strange history, because I remember I was editing Shazam, the comic, as well, and I remember we wanted to get away from. I wanted to get away from the cartoon aspect of Captain Marvel, so there was one issue where I had Alan Weiss come in, if you know Alan's work, who was semi-realistic, and he started doing Captain Marvel, and then I sort of reached the middle ground with a fellow named Don Newton, who was an excellent artist and a big Captain Marvel fan, and
yes.
he did them we had him in World's Finest for a while, and Don did all those, and I always thought that was a great version of Captain Marvel, sort of halfway in between the original cartoon version that C.C. Beck would do, and then the more realistic version that Alan Weiss had done. And Don sort of hit the middle ground, and I always liked it. So, but I don't know. It was a very strange character anyway, because he was the whole thing about him being a little boy and then becoming this adult, which I thought would be kind of hard on your psyche if you actually did that.
Now, there was I don't know if you had heard of it, but since we're talking comics, there was a minor, well, I don't know, they're both gone now, but between Don Newton and C.C. Beck. C.C. Beck was such a traditionalist in how he drew the character, and Don Newton was hired to make the character look realistic in the comics, of course. And he didn't like the realistic approach at all, and they just got into it.
Yeah, he was a curmudgeon himself. He really was, But my whole thing was, if you didn't, you had to go with the flow. You had to go with what was popular. We tried the cartoon Captain Marvel, and it wasn't working. And I'm talking sales-wise. I mean, the artistic community and the artistic comic community, enjoyed it and appreciated it for what it was. But the buying public, who didn't remember that kind of cartoon character that was so popular back in the 40s, was not getting it and was not appreciating it, and therefore we had to do something, and we tried to keep it alive, and we tried to do it that way, and it worked for a while, but who knows? And if the old guys who did it before objected to that, well, it's the same thing as guys of my generation objecting to what they're doing with Superman today, so it's the same sort of thing. So it's a generational thing. It's a thing that, and it'll always change. It'll always be that way. You're never going to be happy with things that change the things that you originally enjoyed. Your childhood has that wonderful veneer across it that everything was wonderful, and then if it changes, oh no, it's no good anymore. So, but that changes. It'll change again.
Yes, and you're right. And like you said about ISIS, that DC doesn't own the rights to the character. DC created their own version of ISIS, which is
right. Yeah, they did.
Completely different from. It has a throwback to the television ISIS and what the stories you wrote, but it's a different character. They call her Andrea Tomas. They changed the name a bit.
It's sort of a homage to her. Yeah, they have a name.
Exactly. Yeah. She's having this love affair with Black Adam. And,
right. Yeah, it's very strange. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. See, I always worry about talking about the comic online because if I keep talking about ISIS online, I'm afraid the government's going to come after me.
Well, maybe the government should go after this version of ISIS. She put in a guest appearance on Smallville too.
Really? Oh yes, she did. That's right. I remember. I actually saw that. I remember that episode. I thought that was cool. Yeah.
Very different from what you wrote, but I enjoyed what you wrote. It was very different from the TV show, and it did go dark, and it went a little psychedelic at points. But I understand that I can appreciate what DC was trying to do. They did want to break from the television show, but I thought you did a good job, Jeff.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think I remember. I'm looking at. I have the covers here in front of me, and I'm looking. I remember that we had a little trouble with the cover of number 6. I don't believe that ooze was supposed to be where it is on her.
See, I noticed that.
I'm just thinking.
Yeah, John would notice that because he's a real perv, and I'm going, the ooze grabbed her right in the rear.
Right, yeah. So I don't know, but that was Rich Buckler. He would do that occasionally just for fun.
But, no, I did notice ISIS was a little better well endowed on the covers of the comic book.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Again, we're trying to sell things, we know our audience, you see.
Well, it sold me. I'm sorry. It sold me.
Good. And, of course, the thing I really regret was I never got to meet Joanna Cameron and all.
Well, she's in Hawaii now, so we'll say you said hello.
I know. And I never got to meet Linda Carter when I was writing Wonder Woman either. So.
Well, she was back just as we make this podcast. She was back in Palm Springs, appearing at an autograph show just yesterday. And
she's going to be at the Baltimore convention, but on Friday and not on Saturday. I'm going to miss her. I'm going to miss seeing her. So, but oh well, someday. Who knows?
Someday, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
so what else you want to know? Oh, you got me on here.
I'm all out of questions, Richard.
Well, I have to ask before we go, was it your idea to create this semi-romantic thing with Rick Mason and Andrea Thomas? Was that your writing idea? Were you told to do that? It was your idea?
I did. Oh, absolutely, yeah, definitely. I thought she needed that. It was definitely something we wanted to add into it. So.
Because John and I noticed as we're doing reviews of both the comic book and the episodes of the TV show that I don't want to call it sexual tension, but it's like Captain Marvel and Mr. Mason, the school teacher, have this well, I don't want to call it a rivalry, but ISIS asked Rick Mason how he would compare himself as a man to Captain Marvel. I'm going, whoa, on a children's show at that.
Yeah, really, yeah. Who knows? Yeah.
Who knows?
But remember, he has, in order to be a man, he has to say Shazam. Otherwise, he's just a kid.
Yeah, Rick Mason doesn't need to say that.
Exactly, so he's a step ahead there.
Because John and I noticed that in the TV show, it seems as though Rick Mason and Andrea Thomas tend to spend a lot of time in each other's apartment. There's an allusion to that.
Yeah, there's something funny about that. In the old television show, the Superman television show, they would have Kellogg's commercials.
Yes, I know. Yes,
and they couldn't have Lois Lane in the commercials
because
they didn't want to have Lois and Clark having breakfast together.
Yes, they didn't want to have breakfast because what were they doing the night before?
Exactly. Yeah. How did they have breakfast together?
But they didn't mind if Jimmy Olsen and Clark Kent and even Perry White came.
That didn't bother them back then. Yeah.
Oh wow! I didn't even think of that. That's true. Oh, well, Jack, once again, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, it was fun.
So, folks, that's going to do it then for this episode of the Shazam ISIS podcast. Stay tuned. We're gearing up for our final reviews as we begin looking at the third and final season of Shazam and the second and final season of The Secrets of ISIS. So stay tuned for all that. Until next time, folks, thank you so much for listening. Once again, Richard, Jack, everyone, take care.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.